My name is Lydia Malamed Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of AIPAD, and it is my privilege today to introduce our first of the series for this show. And it is featuring two of our AIPAD Award winners, but I'll begin with Mr. Vince Aletti, who is our 2024 recipient. I think he needs very little introduction to this crowd, but of course began at Rolling Stone as a music critic and went on to the Village Voice and then to the New Yorker, and is the recipient in 2005 of the Infinity Award at the ICP, and just last year won the Photo Book of the Year Award, the 2023 Photo Book of the Year Award for Aperture and Perry Photo, and we're thrilled this year for him to be our recipient of the AIPAD Award.
Thank you.
He chose to begin this series in conversation with our 2022 AIPAD Award winner, Mr. Jeff Rosenheim of the Metropolitan Museum, the Joyce Menschel Curator in charge.
Very good, yeah.
Yeah. Curator in charge of the Department of Photography at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Jeff is also the steward, cataloger, and caretaker of the Diane Arbus Archive, the Walker Evans Archive, and now the James Vandersea Archive,
Wow.
a landmark collaboration with the Studio Museum in
Whoa.
Harlem. We're thrilled, yes. We're thrilled to have you in conversation to open our talks, and I'll let you take it from here. Thank you both for being with us, and we hope you'll enjoy the fair after the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hello. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Can we
Good.
move to the next slide set, please? Let's see what we're gonna. Let's see. We're gonna go for just a few pieces. There he is. Oh, there you are. There. You're here too.
Yes. Both places.
Yeah. So first of all, it's an honor to share any stage with Vince Aletti,
Thank you so
who,
much.
as you know, is a triple threat. You know what a triple threat is? He's a curator, he is a great writer and critic, and he's also a collector. And we'll talk about a little bit about all of these things. And if any of you, who's been to Vince's apartment? Wow, half of the room. Okay.
I don't even know you.
Yes. How did you get in? So Vince lives the life, literally. You can see this is a hallway in his house, not the only hallway. And I think the next slide, which it's now not going, is a picture I made not that long ago of the parlor room,
Right.
the living room. But imagine, for those of you who haven't been there, a world of someone who is not only a contributor to the language of photography and writing, but also who has great respect for the printed tradition. That tradition, which is alive and well across the hall here at AIPAD, and is represented in all those great books that many of us first saw before we ever saw a photograph. And I look around the room and I see old friends and new friends, but I think interestingly, you know, photographic writing and criticism has to reckon with what Vince's history in the field is in a really interesting way. And it'd be interesting if you might talk about like who you read first, if you read anybody, who was the music critic that you modeled your career on, or the photography critic, if there was such a person.
It's sort of embarrassing to say that when I started writing about photography, I don't remember reading any photography criticism outside of Andy Grunberg in the New York Times. I was always looking for someone who was writing very regularly, usually a newspaper critic, someone who I could read while a show was running, so I could kind of know whether to go see something or not.
Right.
There are seats in the front.
Amy, take a reserved seat.
Yes,
We won't
please.
bite.
But I didn't really, I didn't read a lot of photography criticism when I started writing. I had already been writing music criticism for almost 20 years. And I can't say I modeled myself on anybody either. I just kind of did it, but admired Greg Tate, Lester Bangs, Bob Christgau, writers who had come before me or were simultaneous with me. But there's no way to admire someone like Greg Tate and pretend you could be them.
Right.
It's like, here's somebody who has a unique voice, and that's what I was always looking for in criticism. Someone who I could trust, someone who I could kind of get what they liked, what they regularly could bring to me, and someone who had a real voice.
Right.
So, I mean, there's like Greg Tate, Lester Bangs, no one could write like that. So they were not people you could imitate, but who you could be inspired by.
I think what Vince just said is something that's so true for how I read you, and what is important is that so much criticism comes out late in a show's run, often after, like all of Art Forum, after the show has closed. So you can't really use it as your guide to what you should do that day, that night, that next
That
week.
weekend.
That's right. And I think what Vince's columns, wherever they are, have always done is try to get that information to all of us now. We might not agree with everything any writer would say, but at least we can decide whether we're going to make that detour. And once you follow somebody, once you follow a critic or a curator or a collector down that path, you kind of know where you are. And that's an important thing, especially when there's so much new material coming out. And you are often writing, at least in photography criticism, I can't speak about music, but you are often writing the first reviews that those artists ever got.
Yeah.
And sadly, sometimes the only reviews.
Only reviews. Yeah, no, that is one that people keep coming up to me years later and saying, you reviewed my first show. Of course, I don't remember that, but I was glad that I did, that they have a clipping. And I'm glad that I paid attention to that 20 years ago. And it was, at the time I wrote about it, it was important to me that I had covered that and that that was a show that I liked that I wanted other people to see and decide about. Because my feeling always was that I wanted to sort of point to something. There are seats in the front if you want.
There are 4 seats. Come join us.
I wanted people to trust my voice, and I hope that the more people read me, they'd know whether they could trust me or not.
Right.
I didn't expect them to all like everything I saw, but I wanted them to have a sense of where I was writing from.
That's great.
I thought it was important for them to have a sense of my sensibility.
Well, you're a humanist, and there's a lot of writing that we've all read that is pretty harsh. It can close a show pretty quickly. And I think we all learned on how to be part of this world from you, Vince. And
Oh, thank you.
I really believe it. I have been traveling. I've been in Japan for the last 2 weeks, and I arrived last night. That's sort of an apology, but it's really allows me to set up something. I wrote to Vince and asked, we talked about this months ago, but we talked about some things, and Vince wrote me a letter, quite a nice one, and I just want to read a snippet of it, because you can hear in this note to me that literary style and his succinct way of telling a story with just a few words.
Thank you.
And he writes, as I mentioned, the first of a series of critical profiles I wrote. So he wrote profiles of artists in his mind, and actually, as well as reviews of shows. The first was on Dawood Bey in 1990. And I followed that with a number of people who were having their first or very early shows in New York, including Fazl Sheikh, Barbara S., Debbie Fleming Caffery, who I was in graduate school with, Carrie Mae Reams, Judith Joy Ross, Saul Leiter, and Paul Graham. As I got into it, I wrote about people behind the scenes, often as they were taking on new positions, like Buzz Hartshorn at ICP, Peter Galassi at MoMA, and Maria Hamburg, who hired me in 1987 to work at the Met. I wrote about William Klein when he did his In and Out of Fashion show at ICP, and Larry Clark just before Kids. I was especially happy to write a very mixed review of Avedon's Whitney show. I criticized its lack of fashion work, for one thing, and later a more enthusiastic one of the portraits he did with Maria Hamburg at the Met. I also wrote some of the first reviews of Wolfgang Tillman's first shows at Andrea Rosen Gallery. But the great thing about being at The Voice was that I could move out in any direction I felt confident in. So I also contributed to the paper's mixed opinions on kids. I reviewed Madonna's sex book, Stephen Meisel's ads for CK1, a biography of Alexander Lieberman, a compendium of Nancy comics, and the novels of Dennis Cooper and James Purdy. I wrote the voice obits for Keith Haring, Peter Hujar, Bob Miser, the photographer and publisher of Physique Pictorial. Before I stopped writing about music, I had a column on vinyl singles, a column on music video, and a nightlife page I could assign to anyone from Hilton Als to Fran Lebowitz, who sat for an interview on her early club experiences, later reprinted in my Disco Files book. I could go on. This letter is just unbelievable. Okay, so.
And this is now,
Yes.
this is probably a good moment to, because this is now probably for a lot of people an antique, but to see what the Village Voice, a page in the Village Voice looked like.
It's an antique, and I'm going to photograph it. Okay.
This is my obituary for Peter Hujar from, let's see, December 15, 1987. In any case, this is what a newspaper used to look like. And I just think it's important to have a sense of what these physically, how physically people receive this material.
Yeah. So when I moved to New York, I'm sure everyone had the same thing for those of you who weren't lucky enough to be born here. To get an apartment in New York, you had one of two choices. You had to find someone who had just died and talk the real estate broker into giving you the key, or you had to get the Village Voice the night it came out down on Waverly. Am I right? That's where I got it.
There were a number of places.
Okay, that's where I got it. And to make 1 million phone calls when you got back to wherever you were living, because that's the way it was, or the closest phone booth. Anyway, but The Voice was amazing, and this is my next segue into, I was in college, my senior year in college, and Vince was still writing music criticism, and I bought a record because I had read in The Voice your review of it, which was Michael Jackson's Thriller album. And do you remember buying that album? I played it so loud all the time. And I'm not saying it was the best album I ever bought, but I must say that reading in The Voice, Vince's review of it, told me a lot about music that I didn't know, that I needed to pay attention to the producer. Who was the producer? Quincy Jones.
Quincy Jones.
Okay. That I needed to think about the album as a whole story. That it had a beginning, middle, and an end, just like everyone's exhibitions. And that some songs were better than others, and that was okay. And that it was a mix of musical styles and musical genres. And Vince told me just a few minutes ago that he had followed the Jacksons from the beginning. You want to?
I wrote about the Jackson. I was obsessed with the Jackson 5. I reviewed the Jackson 5 for Rolling Stone, one of their early albums, and opened it up with talking about a dream I had just had about them, where we shared a ham sandwich. And so this is how deep it was for me. And then, went on to actually review the album. which was early on kind of wonderful bubblegum, great pop music from the beginning. That was when they were, sort of strictly Motown. But they defined a certain kind of black pop music that I was already in love with, and they were kind of, making it their own.
So I know we're all here to discuss photography, so we're going to get to that in a moment. But I just want to read just the first 2 lines of something I remember reading and thinking about in a new way, which I think is the best of all criticism, is to challenge you to think about not the thing that's being written about, but the whole genre, the whole area. For those who want to dig deeper than he had been writing about, there's a decidedly paranoid undertow to 3 of Jackson's songs, Beat It, Billie Jean, and Wanna Be Startin' Something. All of his own compositions that gives the album an unexpected tension, a provocative hint of darkness below the glittering surface. The darkest, Beat It, is a deliciously ominous funk rocker that features a screaming guitar solo by Eddie Van Halen and deep echoing bass. In a series of tight clip verses, Michael tries to convince someone, himself, to walk away from a fight, just beat it, instead of trying just to be bad. And it goes on. So what I think we're here to hear just a little bit is, what did you think of this medium you were writing about, photography? What did you see as your role as a critic? You saw 20 shows a week or more, maybe 5 a day when you were...
When I was, exactly.
Yeah. And what were you trying to get at, if it was something, and what did you find along that path?
That's a little difficult, because I can't say there was one thing I was trying to get at. I was always looking for a show that I was excited by and that I wanted to write about. And I knew that I kind of knew that within 2 minutes of walking into a gallery. I mean, anybody who's gone around with me knows that. I walk in and I walk out. If I see something I like, I really want to stay and figure out why. And usually I want to have a sense of why the photographer did this and how, which is why I started writing critical profiles at the beginning, because I wasn't entirely confident in writing extended criticism. I was really new to it, and I didn't feel I had the language, for one thing, but I knew I could write about people and why they did what they did. And so I really started out by talking to photographers about how they approached it, and also how they made a living out of it. I mean, a lot of my sense of going into writing about photography was being a close friend with Peter Hujar, who I could see having difficult times. Knowing that being a photographer was not some exalted thing, it was a job. And you were lucky if you got a show, you were lucky if you got any kind of attention. You were super lucky if you sold anything. So, I mean, it was a time when there was not a lot of success, but people were making wonderful work. And it was interesting for me to find out why and how, and how they made a living out of it, how they made a life out of it. And knowing that and having a sense of that made me more able to talk about the work and have some sense of where it came from and how I responded to it, basically. What is this doing to me? What am I seeing in it that I want to continue seeing? So it really was, in a sense, learning from one photographer after the other to look and to see what they're looking at and see how it affects me.
And just saying on the other side, and we learned from you. So that was part of our education. So we were looking, probably not as deeply and as broadly as you, and we were getting from you a feeling of where the medium was going, where it was at, and how it was functioning just from reading you. You saw many more shows than I would say any of us ever did.
It was, yeah, I was dedicated.
Absolutely. I'm just going to say this, in the December Art Forum issue, just to give you an idea, just one issue, in the December 2002, so that's 22 years ago, Art Forum issue, here's what Vince has reviewed. The Winogrand 1964 show, you know, those color pictures. The Gerhard Richter show at MoMA.
Well, this is the year-end top 10.
Yes, the year-end top 10. But I'm just saying, this is what we got.
This is one of the pleasures of writing for Art Forum in that time, was to do a very boiled down year-end top 10, often of things that I hadn't reviewed during the year, because they were not necessarily photography, which gave me more leeway.
Yeah. I'm just going to just read you the list in just one piece. So anyway, number 1 was Winogrand 64. Number 2 was the Gerhard Richter show, which was a show of all the arts, a multimedia show. But what does Vince say? Richter is hardly the only contemporary artist to work from photographs. But on the evidence of this knockout painting retrospective, he's the only one who seems to understand their power. Okay. Number 3, Hans-Peter Feldman's show in Paris. Number 4, Avedon's show at the Met. That's the show that Maria did of the portrait show with my colleague Mia Feynman. Number 5, Roger Ballen's show at Gagosian. Number 6, Jeff Wall's show at Marion Goodman. Number 7, Bryce Martin's show at Matthew Marks, and it goes on. But your ability to bring this all together and to put these artists and this into context is something that's really notable and
well, thank you. Like I said, that was one of the pleasures, because often I was able to put in an advertising campaign that I thought was really important.
Yeah.
Just all kinds of things that were not necessarily art shows. And I think that was one of the Art Forum was totally open to that.
Yeah, it's great.
I could review a film. I could talk about, I think with one of them I did the return of, oh God, now I'm forgetting. Well, we'll come back to this. Okay. But I was able to really range wide. And so it allowed me to talk about things that had always been interesting to me, that I wanted to cover, but that I didn't have a place for as a photo critic.
Let's talk about that just for a second. You started as a music critic, and is writing about music easier, harder? Are they equally impossible? On a good day, they both flow, but the language of music is, let's call it, slightly more abstract than the language of photographs like on the wall here. This is also in Vince's apartment. I'm going to move to the next slide, not that slide yet. Okay. Music versus visual culture, let's say.
Well, they both, in a sense, one of the reasons why I went to photography is because I didn't feel like I had a language for painting. So, but I really had a lot of ideas about photography, and for the most part, even when it was abstract, it was something to write about, something to describe, which is why music was a similar thing for me. Music was so much about lyrics for me. I never studied music. I could not describe a chord. I could not really describe anything except, it's a scratchy guitar, or I could describe the sound of something, the feeling of something, but I didn't know the musical language for anything. And in the end, it didn't matter. Nobody cared.
Right.
None of my editors said, well, you're missing this.
This bass note.
Right. So, I was writing about what music meant to me, mostly by what it was saying to me. And then how it sounded and all the other things that went along with that. So when I started, when I started writing about photography, it was a lot about what I was looking at and what it conveyed to me.
Right. But you had some experience as a kid growing up with a dad who was an amateur photographer.
True.
You know, there must have been something.
Well, it was, you know, it was important in the end. I didn't even think about this until much later, but my father was an amateur photographer, like a camera club photographer in his spare time, whatever that was. I never really saw a lot of my dad because he worked pretty much every day, and we might hang out on weekends, but that was kind of it. But a lot of the hanging out was in his darkroom, which he built in the house, in the attic. So to have that experience of being in a darkroom as a kid and seeing pictures develop, the whole chemical thing, the smell of all that, there's a kind of romance in that in the end that I could really relate to once I started spending time in Peter Hujar's darkroom or other people's dark rooms. It's just like it all comes back. But it was also that I grew up in a house where photographs were in frames on the wall. And I don't think many people had that experience. So, and I took it for granted, of course, that was how we lived. But I think that certainly made a big difference in my life, that I already understood photography as something that could be put in a frame and seen in that way.
The idea that the photograph is respected enough to be framed and put on the wall. And I'm sure your father and family had picture magazines too. And
yes, that was really influential for me. I've talked a lot about, my father died when I was really young, but he left behind this whole collection of US camera annuals that I spent a lot of time with. That were, you know, if you don't know, they're just like these insane compendiums of basically everything, very pop oriented. But this was a lot of what he left behind were the war years, the 40s. And so they were dense with photojournalism, really tough pictures of the war, you know, year after year until that was over. So to go back through that was something as a kid I tended to avoid, but there were so many other things in those issues that I saw for the first time. Irving Penn and Richard Avedon, Robert Frank, just kind of everybody, because it was a big compendium about everything that was going on without much weighing of, you know, what was truly important in one way or another. At least for my eyes, it was all there. And so that was so valuable to grow up with all that information.
I had a similar experience. I mean, it was grew up in the Midwest, typical, you know, middle-class existence. We got National Geographic magazine, Time, and Life, and they sat around. They weren't thrown away. They sat around and stacked up, and they lived their own life, and they were never out of date. I mean, Time was somewhat timely, but nonetheless, they were kept. And I didn't, you know, between
Where are they now?
Where are they now? I do have a large collection of stuff, but this is one area that I do not have. You know, one of the things that we all know about Vince is that he's a great collector. And he stacks his collections vertically for the most part.
Yes.
And he does live with a lot of framed pictures. And if we go to, we'll get to it again. If we go to the picture that I made of you in your hallway, this is not. Okay, hold on. Anyway, you'll see that Vince lives, there we go. Okay, it's books in the lower level and framed pictures which are stacked like cards on the shelves. And I think it's a very interesting thing. Whenever a curator needs not whenever, but many times a curator is looking for a particular issue of a magazine, Vince is one of the most generous collectors because magazines are fragile. You open them up and they sit in a cradle for 3 months. They don't close the same way when you take them out. But Vince is really nice. When we did the pen show, he was a lender to the pen show. He was a lender to almost all of our shows that use magazines.
And it's important for me to have. I don't want to feel like a hoarder of these things. I really want people.
But you are.
Right, I am. But on the other hand, I want people to see them. I want to be able to have them out in the world, and it's important for me for museums especially, to realize that this is the context where these pictures first appeared,
Right.
and here's how they looked when people first saw them, before they were in a frame, and when they were on the other side from this other picture, it was actually equally interesting.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's so much about context, and it's only get that when you're looking at a whole magazine. And so I'm happy to lend things to shows because I think that provides a whole other way of getting into photography and seeing how it was used and how it was very, part of our lives in a different way.
Maybe this is a good moment to sort of talk about the sort of long-form writing that you've done. You've done your own books. You've written chapters in compendia.
Yeah.
And you have just won the Book of the Year from, just recently.
Yes.
What's that like, and what's in the works? And
Say it again.
What are you
Oh.
working on, if anything, if you can tell us? And do you feel like that's a different style of writing, or do you feel like this is more of this sort of continuation of the short form criticism?
Well, let's go back. Let's just we had a lot of pages from my most recent book that won the award, The Drawer, which
This one.
one of the things I was very strict about is that it had no writing. So it was totally relief. I didn't have to think about writing something. I didn't want people to have to deal with that. I didn't want to set it up. This is what you're getting. It's a picture book. Deal with it.
But tell this crowd what the Drawer book is.
It's essentially the contents of one drawer, one flat file drawer in my apartment, rearranged more than 70 times, just shuffled and then photographed. And this is just one arrangement.
It's like a sampling of what is of interest to Vince Aletti.
Yeah, and so it covers a lot of ground. There's a lot of range of material there. It's basically things that I've collected since the 60s. Let's see, here we go.
Okay.
So it's, for instance, the picture of the two women in front is a picture that Peter Hujar did of two women in a performance group for the Village Voice. So it's a clipping from the Village Voice sometime in the 80s. And the rest is, around that, you can see. It's a lot of advertising. It's a lot of other material that I've saved for one reason or another. And for me, it's kind of a slice out of my brain. So it's like I'm not distinguishing. There's not a higher or low thing here. It's all together. I don't want to define it. And again, I didn't want to write about it.
Right.
I'm happy to talk about it, but the book has no text. So that was my favorite kind of book. Can I do another book like that?
Why not?
Anyway, but the picture, we had at one point a picture of the cover of Harper's Bazaar,
Yeah.
which is kind of the biggest piece of writing that I did. This is
Thank you.
an issue of Harper's Bazaar with cover by Andy Warhol. Amazing photos inside. It was one of 100 magazines that I chose for this book called Issues, a history of photography and fashion magazines, with the idea that fashion magazines from the beginning have not just been about fashion photography, that they've always used photography of all sorts and used it in some of the most interesting ways. So mostly what I tried to do in the book was highlight all those kind of unusual ways that you see photography and fashion, including Lisette Modell, Robert Frank, Lee Friedlander, Bill Brandt, kind of just everybody who worked fairly regularly as a commercial photographer at one point or another, but also people coming up to the present, Wolfgang Tillmans, Jürgen Teller, people who are given like 40 pages as a portfolio that becomes a kind of art project within a fashion magazine. So it's that kind of thing that I want people to kind of look at, because I think it's these are great resources for visual pleasure and culture. And so for me, it's incredibly valuable to have that regular supply. I mean, there were times that I remember going out when I was writing regularly for The New Yorker to see, 20 shows in an afternoon, and coming back and thinking, actually, this magazine is more interesting than any of the shows I saw today.
Right.
And which was a sad moment, of course. I usually would find something to write about, but often I'd get home and there would be this incredible Stephen Meisel spread that I think this is better than anything I saw today. So that's why I did the book Issues, just to sort of have get that out there, because I think there is an incredible amount of great fashion photography, most of which you'll never see in a museum, most of which you'll never see outside of a magazine.
Sure. So that's actually good for us to explore. We're going to take some questions at the end, but as a sort of last thing, sort of where are we today? Photography has achieved, partly due to AIPAD's members and their the audience, us, working very hard to put photography in the eyes of people, keep it present. But when we all, most of us, looking at the age of us, started doing this, photography was primarily shown in photography galleries. And a lot of those are no longer in business because we've lost a lot of those progressive innovators, but also because photography is now shown pretty widespread, in a widespread way, at galleries that show paintings and drawings and sculpture.
Kind of everywhere, ideally.
Video, that's right. And whether or not emerging artists find their way into those galleries or not, but photography is no longer in the restricted space of the photo gallery, for better or for worse.
No.
So when you're out there looking for photography, where are you going? What are you seeing? And how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, as always, I always go everywhere. When I at different points was doing gallery tours for ICP or some other organization, and one of the things I said very clearly at the beginning is, we're going to photo galleries, but if you're going around, go to everything, go see everything, because it's all here. I mean, don't just skip this gallery because it's a painting. You really, this is the most, this is great new material. You may not like it, but really you owe it to yourself to see everything that's happening here. And photography is part of that, but it needs to be seen as part of this conversation.
Very good.
And so yeah, I see everything. I mean, it's sad now because there are way fewer photo shows anywhere. I was thinking about that recently. If I was working at the New Yorker now, and if they actually had space for reviews, there would be nothing, there would be very little for me to write about, which is, I would, typically I'd review 3 to 4 shows an issue a week. and I'd have 10 left over for the
Right.
next week.
So we went from a moment where there was this plurality of voices and emerging mid-career classics to a time where that's all changed.
It's difficult.
Yeah.
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 It's something that's hard to talk about.
It is hard to talk about. But it seems, people say, what is the state of photography? And I say, it's the same as it's always been. It's just emerging in a different place. And these things have changed everything. And yet, it still is the great democratic medium. And photographers are getting their images out there through different pathways. And the gallery structure that was created by people in this room, and a lot of people in the room over there.
Yeah.
We've lost some great people. Our friends,
Julie Saul, Bonnie Ben Ruby,
So
along the way.
And I think photography, the museum world is following it pretty seriously.
Well, that's really gratifying.
Yeah.
Because there's not, and there's a sense where, at least on a number of museum levels, that it's not just classics.
Yeah.
It's some sense of also redefining what's classic.
Right.
And bringing in, young work.
Yeah, I think it's important for all of us. Okay, so Vince has agreed to answer some questions, should there be any, and I know that the AIPAD organization, for which we are both grateful for receiving this very same award, really believes that these next days ahead are important to the field, to New York, and to photographers and the community that support them. And we want to thank you very much for coming out on this absolutely beautiful sort of late spring
Right.
day. There's no way I would be here right now, but I know that, I'm speaking for Vince, that we really appreciate it. And please let us know how we can answer a question or two.
Yeah, any questions?
Yes. John?
Yes.
Well, I'm going to make a comment rather than a question. If you don't know, there's an absolutely fantastic Alexei Brodovich show at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia,
Yeah.
to which Vince has loaned a number of Harper's Bazaar and Harper's Junior magazines. That's a key inflection point
Thank you for mentioning
for that, and it's absolutely fabulous. Totally makes the exhibition, that whole room.
I can't wait to see it, and we also lent from the Met some work to the
Yes.
show.
All the Brodovich,
Yeah.
the ballet stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's on my list. I just have been a little busy, so I
Yes.
haven't
Well,
seen
it's
it.
Philadelphia.
So thank you, and come to Philadelphia.
It's hard enough to get New Yorkers out to Brooklyn sometimes.
Yeah.
I haven't followed the New York art world so much lately in the last couple of years. I wasn't aware of this diminishing number of photography shows. So I wanted to ask both of you, what's the comment? What's behind it? And is it a worldwide phenomenon? Or is it in our local corner here?
Good question.
Yeah, is it?
I don't know. What do
I
you?
don't know either. It's cyclical, I'm sure, and it's as I was thinking about this coming today, suddenly what I said about there weren't that many photo shows to review, suddenly there was a kind of spate of really interesting photo shows in town. So it comes and goes, but it's much less than it used to be. It's much less regular, and there are fewer dedicated photo galleries.
Yeah.
So there are fewer places where you're going to see photography. What's happened over the past 20 years is that, as Jeff said, more and more non-photo galleries have been showing photography really seriously. So it's not just restricted to one area, and I'm happy to see how many new places there are that I didn't expect to see photography. But it is not a great moment for the field in terms of, especially photographers who have been out there for a long time who don't have a gallery. Who
Yeah,
don't
so,
have
I
a
mean,
regular place to show.
My take on that is that it's skewing towards just contemporary practice everywhere. And it's not, I don't think it's the age or the maturity of the photography community and the practitioners today, but that it's all the galleries, not all, so many of the galleries are focusing on contemporary. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but it's happened. It certainly has happened here. Whether I spent 10 days in San Francisco installing an Irving Penn show at the De Young. Like Philadelphia, it's worth the detour. It's a little further away from New York, and it also has a lot of magazines in it. And I saw some very nice photography shows everywhere in San Francisco. San Francisco is a photography city like New York is. There's a lot of activity in San Francisco right now.
And had Pier 24 reopened while you were there?
Pier 24 is in its last year. Sadly, Andy Pilara, who created it, is closing it down at the end of the year, and they were installing the show. It isn't up. But it will be or is already, but not when I was there.
Not really, okay.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by Nicole Wozniak's magazine, Egoist.
Yes.
Yep.
Why?
I don't know that.
Now, there's a good, actually, yes, I have. I included an Egoist issue in my book called Issues, because it was a significant magazine. I don't know if it's still ongoing.
I understand that it is.
Okay. Every once in I see something every once in a while. It was very sort of irregular, but it had majorly Abaddon.
Yeah.
It was an incredible.
Very clever ads that she designed.
True.
Ads or fake ads.
No, it's such a consistent sensibility running that magazine. If anybody doesn't know it, it was actually, maybe it still is, quite large, about this big magazine, outsized rather, beautifully printed on thick paper.
Yeah.
It was like an art project, and priced that way.
Yeah.
But it was really, it was.
I think she and Dick had some special relationship because it was like a,
in quotes.
Yes, in quotes.
And is there a place for that type of magazine?
Sure.
Yes, but and I think there is always a place for these kind of special magazines. It's not like they have a huge audience. I don't think they expect to sell, a lot of copies.
No.
But there is always a place for that kind of, beautifully done, exclusive kind of material, and especially when it includes material that you won't see anywhere else. All the early issues are collector's items.
You said you reviewed it in your issue.
I included one issue in Issues because I wanted to acknowledge, a lot of what Issues was is at least touching base with all the key magazines that were great sources of photography. And I think what the issue that I included was one that included Abaddon's pictures from the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I thought was a really interesting series for him. Again, it was sort of a collector's item that's bound to be seen in a vitrine somewhere in the future.
I want to just throw something out to the audience just to, Steve, we'll get to your question. This is my little polemic. I don't think we can have a field. I don't think photography can thrive without two things. If we don't have good writing about it, good criticism, good commentary.
Or enough,
Right.
right.
We can't make it. And we cannot make it if the history of photography and visual culture is not taught at the university level. And sadly, I'm also seeing many fewer history of photography courses being taught in school. We have at least one scholar still in the job. I'm looking at her. I'm really worried about this, that across the country, those positions are going away, and there's communications professors and whatever that is, et cetera. And that basically this field is, as a discipline, is being diminished by just having contemporary multimedia professorships.
No.
So we need to protect that, and I don't know what to do about that. And we need to make sure that the magazines and how we support them, those magazines that we do have, they do have regular writing about photography, we have to support them.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we're going to do that either, but I try. Steve, you're on.
My career in photography, starting as a writer and a curator, and then
Steve, turn the mic
Just
toward
gallerist.
There you go.
Good, great.
Starting as a writer and curator and a gallerist was a dance with Vince Aletti. First of all, I want to thank you both. This is a wonderful conversation, really beautiful, gentle, not one word of jargon. Thank you.
We don't know any jargon.
Vince, as editor and a writer at The Voice, supported for shows I did about the civil rights movement, and with Robert Atkins, who I think Vince probably assigned to work on that as well. And later as a gallerist, I mean, I knew that Vince did 4 pieces a week for The New Yorker, and if it was going to be 3 a certain week, I would know that, and I would be very unhappy. And then when The New Yorker basically eliminated Vince's position, it was just a different world. I mean, I knew it was a different world in terms of criticism and what people would hear about galleries. I mean, this is true.
It was a huge loss.
Yeah, huge. So this is, what I'm saying is true of many, many gallerists. And then literally a dance, because Vince and I are neighbors, and I would see him on the street, and some of you may know he doesn't move necessarily the fastest pace, but I always thought he was going much faster than me, because he'd be going, you know, I have to see 10 shows now, and I have to do this, and I have to do that. And then these magazines are coming out. I'm rushing to Gem Spa, because this is coming out in an hour.
Yeah.
And frequently, he would be
Gem
rushing
Spa.
to Gem Spa.
Gem Spa.
That's the place Jeff was trying to remember, where The Voice would come out.
Yeah.
On corner of 8th Street and 2nd Avenue. So, yeah, I mean, it's been wonderful dancing with Vince.
Thank
And
you.
I'm sad in a way that some of that is over. This is partly what we're mourning
Well,
today.
Yeah.
you know, let me just touch on what you said about the New Yorker, because when I left the New Yorker, it was in order to do issues. I knew I couldn't write a weekly, I couldn't keep up with seeing all the shows, writing about them every week, and also working on a big book project. So I had to put all that behind me and just, you know, focus on the book, with the idea that maybe I would go back to the New Yorker when that was over. It's not like they invited me back. And at the point, and what disappointed me most was that they never hired anybody while I was away to write about photography. They said, oh, you know, everybody can do it. And in fact, yeah, maybe they could, but they never
don't.
did. They never did.
Right.
So, you know, every once in a while, somebody, a non-photo critic would write about photography, but basically they just didn't. And if they don't have somebody sort of dedicated to doing that, it's not going to happen.
Also,
It's the same way I feel about museums.
Yeah.
If there's not somebody as a photo curator, it's not going to happen.
The thing is that when you know there's a regular voice, as you were saying, and you use voice very carefully in your language, when there's a regular voice that you can follow, you create a community. And if you have to wait and see if they're going to review anything, and it's a different voice each time, it's hard to follow it.
It's hard to care about it.
It's hard to care about it.
I have really enjoyed this. Vince, when I was at Sotheby's, we were blessed. Sometimes you would come to the previews, and we even made it into the New Yorker a few times, which was a big deal for us. But I just wanted to know, actually, from both of you, when I look back on my life in the auction business, it's changed. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on what's happened to the market.
Oh.
You know, that I can't really address at all. It was one thing I didn't want to know about the market. Generally, I didn't want to know what the photos were priced at. I really didn't want to know that. I didn't want to get sort of caught up in that. And I was curious about the auctions, but I rarely looked at results, except for maybe, things that I was curious about as pictures. So it was an area that I tried to stay away from. I mean, it's hard to, because it's impinging on everything in the end, but it's something I really don't know about. Maybe Jeff has a different approach.
I mean, I have to pay attention to the market in the same way.
Well, but in a much more intimate way.
Yeah. I mean, I think the market exists. Whether or not the auctions today are as curated as yours were, I think not. And the art that I think I'm most interested in, and my colleagues in the field are most interested in, some great things are at auction, some are in the galleries, and some are being sold, there, and some are not being sold at all. And things that you could always expect to see, or an example of something, is nearly impossible to find, not because it's not valued, but because either those have all gone into public collections, which you contributed to, or...
Oh, example?
Well, daguerreotypes.
Oh.
Denise did great work before she went to Sotheby's with daguerreotypes, and there were great daguerreotype auctions, and there was wonderful things in the field. How many galleries have a daguerreotype in the room next door? Is there one?
Yeah, there are a few.
Are there two? Are there three? No. Okay. Where are they? Yes. Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah. Bring it home. Bring it home.
So for those of us who are just getting to the show today,
Yeah.
are there particular booths or artists that really stood out to you?
Yes. Yes, but I'm forgetting her name at the moment. At Higher Pictures, does someone remember? Carla Williams. For me, the knockout booth of the show.
All right.
Just really, really interesting things that you need to see in person, that you will not get the impact of this work from reproduction.
Very good.
And that, I think, is what's so valuable about a show like this and about shows, period.
Yeah.
That, we think we see things, and we're looking at a screen.
That's right.
No, we're not seeing them. I thought that just recently because there was an incredible Richard Prince show at Gagosian just recently that was only photography, only his early photography. And I realized that most of that work I'd never seen outside of a book.
Yeah.
I'd never seen it that much, and I'd only seen it reproduced. So in a sense, I'd seen it, but I'd never really got it. I never saw what the object was like, and Prince is so much about the object.
They're pretty good.
About the size. I know, they're incredible. So it really, blew me away.
Yeah.
So, but I'm trying to think of, there's a lot of good work here, but most booths are pretty varied, which I like too. So I don't know. You haven't even been into the show
Literally,
yet, so.
I arrived for this talk. I've been in Japan, so I can't comment. And even if I could comment, I shouldn't comment.
Right.
But you did bring it home. Just to say that we need this organization to thrive. We need our organizations like ICP and Aperture to thrive, and I want to make sure they do. The high tide raises all ships. And I really believe in that. So thank you all.
Thanks for coming.